A tourist threw a shoe at a royal guard, thinking he could do whatever he wanted. But the guard moved, and his unexpected reaction left the entire plaza frozen. No one could have guessed what would happen next. London was basking in the morning sunlight. The cobbled streets near Buckingham Palace were filled with crowds of tourists, swarming toward the royal landmark like bees to honey. Sounds, children's shouts, camera shutters clicking, and bursts of laughter melted into a chaotic symphony. Yet, amid all this noise, one figure stood out in absolute stillness. The royal guard stood at his post like a stone statue. His scarlet tunic was impeccably pressed, and the towering bearskin hat lent him the monumental presence of an ancient warrior. The young soldier allowed himself not the slightest movement, even as a group of giggling children tugged at each other's backpacks, just a few feet away. He could see them out of the corner of his eye, and yet he remained motionless. Such was the tradition. Enter Michael Branson, a man with a cocky grin and an air of unshakable confidence. His balding head, athletic shoulders, and booming voice marked him as a former footballer, accustomed to applause and fame. The 40-year-old from Birmingham had arrived in London with friends, determined to take the capital in his own style. For Michael, this trip was a chance to show off for his buddies, push boundaries, and of course, rack up views on his funny videos. "Here are our dolls!" His voice rang out, startling nearby tourists. Heads turned, searching for the source of the noise. Yes, it was him. Loud, self-assured, and clearly not planning to behave modestly. Pointing a finger at the guard, he violated the unspoken rule of distance. "I bet he won't even blink if I test whether he's real or not," Michael said with mock innocence, glancing at his friends. His buddies erupted into laughter. Loud, crude laughter that sent a nearby baby stroller rolling slightly away in alarm. One of them had already pulled out a phone, pointing the camera at the unfolding scene. Here it was, the show. "Michael, don't be an idiot," one of his friends muttered with a smile, though there wasn't much conviction in his voice. They were all waiting. What would he do next? Michael approached the white line marking the boundary that no one was allowed to cross. He stood almost face to face with the guard. "Sir, could I ask you to smile?" Michael drawled, contorting his face into a grotesque grin and sticking out his lips. "Oh wait, I forgot. You probably don't allow jokes on duty." He leaned back, showing off to his friends and the crowd just how funny he found himself. The guard didn't flinch. His eyes remained fixed ahead, staring somewhere through Michael. Such composure, impressive, right? But to people like Michael, this calm was like a red flag to a bull. "All right, lads, watch and learn," he shouted, removing his shoe with exaggerated carelessness. "Oh, Michael, what are you doing?" Someone in the crowd muttered in irritation. "That's too much now!" A woman in a blue coat grabbed her son's hand and led him away from the scene. Other people pulled out their phones, while a few quietly voiced their disgust. "Is he out of his mind?" came a whisper from the crowd. "That's a violation. Who behaves like that?" But Michael was in his own world. He brandished the shoe as though winding up for a throw and sneered. "Catch!" A moment, and silence. The air grew thick. The crowd froze. The guard didn't move, even now. His face remained as stone-like as ever, as though the shoe, Michael, and this entire absurd theater were nothing but shadows to him. But something was stirring in that shadow. The crowd's anger. The people weren't laughing as Michael had hoped. No. Their faces showed disapproval, and their eyes began to burn into his back. "Why are you doing this?" came a woman's voice. But Michael just grinned. He didn't notice that everyone already saw him as a clown, not a hero. Even his friends were looking at him strangely now. "Well, Michael, you wanted a show, and it seems you've got one. But who is the star of this scene? The guard? Or you, Michael, who's lost all connection to respect and common sense?" The crowd held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Michael's shoe, as though time itself had slowed, flew through the air and landed with a dull thud on the pavement just inches from the guard's polished boot. The silence was deafening. The sounds of the crowd, camera clicks, children's voices, laughter. had melted into one long, stretched-out pause. Everyone froze, unable to believe what they had just seen. Someone in the crowd gasped. Another hissed through their teeth. "Has he completely lost it? That's a violation," someone called out louder from the right. "Who does that? That's a guardsman, not a decoration." The crowd began to murmur, their curious glances transforming into judgmental stares. But Michael seemed oblivious. He stood with a broad grin and outstretched arms, as though he'd just scored a winning goal. "Well, statue," he jeered, his voice cutting through the heavy air. "Maybe they should send you to a museum." "Wait, no. Even there you'd be boring." The guard remained motionless. His eyes betrayed nothing, but the air around him felt heavier. Every muscle in his body seemed tense, yet not a single feature of his face shifted. It was a silent display of dignity impossible to put into words. "That's some composure," Michael smirked, turning back to his friends, who by now weren't laughing so hard. One of them murmured hesitantly, "Mike, enough. You're going too far." "Oh, come on," Michael scoffed, oblivious to the rising tension. He turned back to the guardsman and stepped over the white line, the very line no one was allowed to cross. "Step back!" A sharp, commanding voice rang out. An officer was now approaching the scene, his footsteps echoing heavily on the cobblestones. Stopping beside the guardsman, he fixed Michael with an icy stare and barked, "Stop immediately and step back behind the white line. This is your final warning." Well, that's it, thought the onlookers. Michael would surely retreat now, apologize, and the situation would end. That's what normal people do when they're told they've crossed a boundary, right? But no, not Michael Branson. "Seriously?" Michael sneered, taking an exaggerated step forward, further invading the guardsman's space. His voice, full of bravado, rang across the square. "I've got you all going, haven't I?" The crowd erupted in murmurs and shouts. People openly voiced their outrage. "What are you doing? This is shameful!" "Take your shoe and leave," a middle-aged man shouted, standing with his wife, who clutched his hand and whispered, "How can you mock him like that?" Michael ignored them all. He stood with his arms spread wide, like an actor basking in the spotlight. In his mind, he was the star of the show. Tourists, he believed, had paid for entertainment. And the guardsman? To Michael, he wasn't a person, just part of the scenery. "Film this, Danny!" Michael shouted to his friend. "This'll go viral!" Danny hesitated, his hands shaking as he held up his phone, torn between filming and stopping his friend. The tourists' anger was now palpable. Some tried to step in, others shouted at Michael to stop. The guardsman remained still, but now his silence seemed less forgiving and more condemning. It was a quiet reminder. "I am not here for your amusement. I stand here for something greater than either of us." Michael couldn't see it. He had already crossed a line. Not just the physical one, but the moral one. For the crowd, he was no longer the funny footballer from Birmingham, but the embodiment of arrogance and disrespect. "This is why those lines exist," murmured the woman in the blue coat. And yet everyone knew this scene wasn't over. The crowd froze, as if time itself had decided to stop. And then, the guardsman moved. Not just a step, but a motion so sharp and decisive that those around gasped in shock. His boots struck the cobblestones with such precision and weight that even the air seemed to thicken. "Whoa!" someone murmured softly. The guardsman bent down and picked up Michael's shoe. And then something happened that no one could have expected. Instead of ignoring the incident or returning it to the tourist, the soldier raised the shoe above his head, like a trophy, and slowly turned his head toward the crowd. A hushed murmur rippled through the square. Someone laughed nervously, but most people remained silent, not knowing what was happening. The moment was at once grand and unnerving. The guardsman's gesture was almost theatrical, but not comical. It felt profound. Michael paled, his smug grin vanished. It was as if he couldn't comprehend what the guardsman was doing. "Is this part of the show?" one of his friends muttered, but the confidence in his voice was gone. The guardsman, still holding the shoe, walked to the white line but did not cross it. He froze again, and silence reclaimed the square. People held their breath. Even the wind seemed to stop blowing. Then came a new shock. A shrill scream pierced the air. "Jake! Stop!" A woman's voice shattered the stillness. A small boy, no older than 6, burst from the crowd. He was wearing a bright blue jacket and a ridiculous cap on his head. He ran toward the guardsman, oblivious to the people, the boundaries, or the rules. No one managed to stop him. His tiny legs caught on a stone, and he stumbled forward, heading straight for the sharp edge of the granite curb. "No!" his mother shrieked. Everything happened in an instant, but the guardsman reacted with lightning speed. With the agility of a trained athlete, he dropped the shoe and leapt forward. His movements were so quick and precise that they seemed unreal. Stretching out his arms, he caught the boy just before he hit the ground. The square froze. The whole world seemed to shrink to this one moment. The boy, trembling and terrified, clutched at the guardsman's uniform button. His wide, tear-filled eyes looked up at his rescuer with gratitude and fear. "Thank you, sir," he whispered faintly. The guardsman, his face as stoic as ever, gently set the boy on his feet and adjusted his cap. His movements were careful, almost fatherly. The boy's mother, still unable to speak, covered her mouth with her hands, choking back sobs. The crowd was still silent. Some were already wiping tears from their eyes. Others recorded the moment, not to laugh now, but to capture this scene of honor and humanity. But the guardsman wasn't finished. He turned, walked to where Michael's shoe lay on the cobblestones, picked it up, and, to everyone's astonishment, knelt down before the boy. "Return this to the one who doesn't know how to respect boundaries," he said calmly but firmly. His voice cut through the air like a blade. The boy didn't understand at first, but obediently took the shoe. The gesture was simple, yet so powerful that it left the crowd in awe. "Here," the boy said, walking up to Michael and holding out the shoe. His voice was small, but it carried an undeniable truth. "You shouldn't throw shoes at good people." Michael stood silent. His face burned with shame, and his hands hung uselessly at his sides. Just minutes ago, he had been the center of attention, the king of his own comedy. Now he looked small and ridiculous, a man who had failed to understand the moment or the place. The crowd erupted in applause. People shouted, "Bravo! That's a real man. That's what honor looks like." "And you're a disgrace," someone shot at Michael. The guardsman rose and returned to his post. Once again, he stood still, unflinching, unwavering, just as before. But now, to everyone who had witnessed the scene, he was more than a guardsman. He was a symbol of honor and dignity. Michael clutched the shoe in his hand and hung his head. His show was over, but not in the way he had planned. He hadn't become a hero. He had become a lesson, for himself and for everyone who had watched. Michael stood with his head down, gripping the shoe tightly, as if it were the last piece of his dignity that hadn't yet crumbled in front of everyone. Not long ago, he had been loud and confident. Now he looked like a boy who had been caught doing something shameful. His friends remained silent. One of them muttered quietly, not looking at Michael, "Maybe it's time we go." But it wasn't over yet. From the crowd emerged an elderly woman with a cane. She moved slowly, but each step carried weight. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back, and her tear-filled eyes were fixed on the guardsman with deep respect. The square, still buzzing with quiet anger, fell silent once again. "My father," her voice trembled, but she continued, "My father served in World War II." The crowd parted, letting her through. People watched her with reverence, suddenly realizing that what had just happened was bigger than one foolish tourist's joke. He always said, "Honor is not just a word." Today, I saw that with my own eyes, the woman said, tears rolling down her cheeks as she approached the guardsman. Everyone held their breath. She reached the soldier and, in a breach of protocol, gently placed her hand on his shoulder. Her hand trembled, but the gesture was filled with deep respect. "Thank you," she whispered. The guardsman didn't pull away. He simply stood there, staring ahead. Only the slightest, almost imperceptible nod gave away his acknowledgement. In that silent movement, there was more humanity and dignity than in all of Michael's bravado over the past half hour. The crowd began to buzz. Someone started clapping, and within moments the entire square was filled with thunderous applause. The sound echoed off the buildings, rolling through the streets like a wave. It wasn't applause for a show. It was for the Guardsman, for what he symbolized: resilience, discipline, and respect for tradition. "There's your show, mate," a man shouted toward Michael. "Take a good look at yourself." Michael slumped even further. He no longer looked like the star of the show. Now he was just a foolish man who had crossed a line he shouldn't have. "Let's go, Mike," one of his friends said, now openly disgusted. Michael turned and began walking away, his head down and the shoe still clutched in his hand. He looked small and pitiful, a shadow of the arrogant man who had taunted the Guardsman. People watched him go, their faces full of judgment. "Men like him need to learn respect," muttered the woman in the blue coat. Meanwhile, the Guardsman returned to his post. He resumed his stance, motionless as ever. But now, there was something majestic about him. For everyone who had witnessed the scene, he was no longer just a soldier. He was a symbol of honor and principles that could not be broken by cheap antics. The video that went viral, cameras had captured it all. Within an hour, videos titled "When a Guardsman Saves Honor and a Life at the Same Time" had millions of views. Comments flooded in from all over the world, full of admiration and outrage. "What patience and composure! This man deserves a medal!" And the tourist? Shame on him. I hope he realizes how foolish he looked. Honor and tradition are not toys for idle fools. Respect them. That evening, the little boy sat on the sofa beside his mother, his face glowing with excitement as he showed her the video on his phone. "Mom, is he a superhero?" the boy asked, his eyes wide. His mother wrapped her arm around him and smiled softly. "Yes, sweetheart, just in a different costume." Somewhere on a London square, under the dim light of street lamps, the Guardsman still stood, unyielding, unshakable, and impassive. But now, in his shadow, there lived a story of honor and resilience. A story that reminded everyone, some symbols are above mockery, and they cannot be broken.